Imagine a city that rose out of stone, not built brick by brick, not patched together with timber, but carved straight into the face of rose-red cliffs. And the strangest part? It's not in Greece, not in Rome, but hidden in one of the harshest deserts of the Middle East. You've probably seen it in Indiana Jones. And maybe you thought, oh, come on, that's just Hollywood exaggeration. But no, this place is real. Its name is Petra. Here's the funny thing. Millions of people recognize the facade of Petra, but almost nobody remembers the people who actually built it. A people who once controlled the most lucrative trade routes of the ancient world, who were so wealthy that gold and silver practically poured through their hands, yet vanished without a sound. So who were they? How did they turn a barren canyon into the richest trade hub of their time? And what made them disappear, leaving behind a silent city of stone buried under sand for centuries? That's the story I want to tell you today. A story so bizarre it feels impossible, and yet it's all real. The story of the Nabateans, the Amazons of the desert, the mafia of the caravan routes, and the master stone carvers of the ancient world. If you're ready, walk with me through that narrow canyon, and prepare to be stunned by a city that, by all logic, shouldn't even exist where it does. Now picture yourself as an Arab merchant around the year 50 CE. After days of leading your caravan, sand whipping your face, your water skin nearly empty, you're dreaming of an oasis, when suddenly the canyon walls open and you stop dead in your tracks. Towering before you is a rock wall the height of a 10-story building, carved top to bottom with columns, gods, and Greek-style ornaments, so intricate you'd swear you stumbled into Athens by mistake. The midday sun hits the sandstone, setting it ablaze in fiery pink. And your first thought? Wait a second. This is the desert. Who in their right mind would carve an entire Greek temple into solid rock out here? Answer is not aliens, it was the Nabateans. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You've spent days crossing the desert. The wind has whipped your skin raw, your lips are cracked, your water skin nearly empty. Ahead of you, there's nothing but endless sand and rock. Just that. Same burned yellow monotony. And then suddenly, the canyon walls begin to open and you freeze in place, because in front of you isn't another stretch of wasteland. It's a colossal wall of rose-red stone, towering like a 10-story building carved with columns, reliefs, and intricate designs. The midday sun strikes it head-on, setting the whole cliff ablaze like a giant flame. Your first thought? Hold on. Who on earth would spend years carving a full-blown Greek temple into the middle of a desert canyon? And the answer isn't aliens. It isn't magic. It was a people almost nobody remembers today, the Nabateans. They started out as nomads, wandering, with their camels pitching tents in the sand, surviving off a handful of oases, and yet somehow they pulled off the unthinkable. They turned a barren canyon into a thriving city, a glittering trade hub that some scholars now call the Las Vegas of the desert. If Egypt is the land of pyramids, and Greece the land of white marble temples, then Petra, the city of the Nabateans, is something altogether different. It wasn't built brick by brick. It was carved straight into the cliffs of red sandstone. Where other civilizations stacked stone to create, the Nabateans removed stone to reveal. Out of subtraction came palaces, temples, and tombs that looked like they should belong in a dream. One archaeologist once put it perfectly. Petra wasn't built. Petra was born from the rock. Poetic, yes. But when you walk through the mile-long slot canyon that serves as Petra's entrance, you realize it's no exaggeration. Towering cliffs 250 feet high press in on either side, squeezing the path so narrow you feel swallowed alive, until, all at once, the walls burst open, and sunlight floods onto the facade of the treasury, Petra's most famous monument. The Nabateans knew exactly what they were doing. They turned the very act of arriving into a theatrical performance, from the shadows of a claustrophobic gorge into the blinding reveal of grandeur. For a merchant who had just spent weeks dragging a caravan across lethal desert, this wasn't just impressive, it was overwhelming. And that was the point. The Nabateans are a story of contradictions. Nomads who should have been little more than tent dwellers, herding camels and drinking sour milk, somehow became masters of the most profitable trade route of their time, the incense road. Every bag of frankincense resin, every pinch of myrrh, used for perfume, medicine, even embalming mummies, passed through their territory. From nobodies, they became the Amazons of the desert. If Google today makes its billions on ads, and Amazon rules e-commerce, then 2,000 years ago, the Nabateans did the same thing, with camels instead of servers, caravans instead of broadband. What's fascinating is how their neighbors described them. The Greeks scoffed, "They eat poorly, sleep under the sky, but nobody can outtrade them." The Romans sneered, "They're so rich they have more silver than wine." And the Arabs whispered, "If you mess with their caravans, you've already signed your own death notice." So the Nabateans were mocked, feared, and grudgingly respected all at once, the desert's very own mafia. And that's the paradox of Petra. Its beauty isn't just in the stone. It's in the fact that it shouldn't exist where it does. And yet it does, pulling in explorers in the 19th century and tourists today, all bewitched by this impossible city. But behind those rose-red walls lies an even bigger story. A people who turned disadvantages into strengths, who made a deadly desert into the beating heart of commerce and culture. Picture it. A caravan stretching for miles, camels swaying under heavy loads, bells jingling in the brutal noon heat. A merchant squints against the glare, clutching a pouch of precious incense, hoping to reach Petra, where water, shade, wine, music, and gods carved in stone all awaited. That was the dream, made real in the desert. But this is only the beginning. The bigger question is, how did a group of nomads with no famous literature, no massive armies manage to build an empire carved in stone? And how did they hold it for centuries, surrounded by giants like Rome, Greece, and Egypt? That's what we'll uncover next. The true secret of the Nabateans, the art of controlling trade, protecting caravans, and turning Petra into the desert's international crossroads. Picture yourself standing in the middle of an endless sea of sand. The wind howls, the daytime sun scorches you like an oven, and the night chills bite like ice. In a place where one sandstorm could erase the tracks of an entire caravan, there was once a people who turned this brutal desert into the busiest trade highway of the ancient world. They were the Nabateans, the Amazons of the desert. At dawn, before the sun climbs too high, their camel caravans would already be filing out of Petra. Imagine a freight train today a mile long, stacked with shipping containers. Now replace the steel cars with camels, dozens, sometimes hundreds, each groaning under 100 pounds of incense, frankincense, myrrh, resins, oils, ivory, furs, even gold. They swayed and grumbled, grew as if complaining, but they never stopped. And with every plodding step, money poured into Nabatean coffers. What set the Nabateans apart was their logistics. Where other tribes lived day to day, chasing oases and luck, the Nabateans ran the desert like a global shipping company. They mapped every spring, every hidden gorge with water, every shortcut through shifting sands. Greek historians admitted, sometimes grudgingly, the Nabateans know the desert's paths so well they need no maps. If GPS guides you down, the freeway today, they were the living GPS of 2,000 years ago, knowing every refueling stop in the desert as if it were the palm of their hand. But thirst wasn't the only danger. The bigger threat was bandits. The desert had no police, no law. A caravan could be ambushed, stripped bare, gone overnight. The Nabateans turned that weakness into their greatest strength. They didn't just run transport, they offered something that looked suspiciously like insurance. If you were a merchant, you had two choices: pay the Nabateans, and your caravan traveled under their protection. Safe, sound, no problem. Refuse to pay, and, well, strange things happened. Bandits would appear out of nowhere, and curiously, the only people capable of saving you were the Nabateans themselves. It didn't take long for merchants to get the message. One Roman writer joked bitterly, "Anyone who wishes to survive the desert must first make an offering to the god Nabatea." And that was the genius of their model. The Nabateans were shipping company, insurance firm, police force, and when convenient, the bandits too. A vertically integrated business. Honestly, the Sicilian mafia centuries later could have taken notes. Their trump card, though, was Petra itself. Nestled in a narrow canyon with only a few tight entrances, Petra was a fortress you couldn't storm. A small guard could hold off an army. But more importantly, Petra was the desert's international hub. Every caravan stopped here, watered its animals, rested, traded goods, and of course paid taxes. Merchants grumbled about the steep fees, but they always came back, because no place was safer and no place was more convenient than Petra. That's how the Nabateans became the desert's kingpins. They grew so wealthy that their vaults overflowed with silver and gold, yet they lived modestly, almost austerely, as if deliberately disguising their luxury. To the Greeks and Romans, they looked like shabby nomads, thin, poorly dressed, eating simple meals. But step into Petra and you'd see temples, tombs, treasuries, all carved straight into stone with a scale and finesse that rivaled Athens and Rome. And that contrast, that facade of poverty, hiding a civilization of staggering wealth and brilliance, is what makes the Nabateans so fascinating. Outwardly, they looked like ragged desert folk. Inwardly, they were master builders, savvy traders, and desert tacticians who had turned survival itself into an art form. So when you think of Amazon dominating e-commerce or FedEx ruling logistics, remember, 2,000 years ago in the deadliest deserts on Earth, the Nabateans were already doing it. Their camels were the trucks, their caravans the shipping lanes, and Petra, the city carved from stone, was their global headquarters. And this is just the economic side of their story, because the Nabateans weren't only merchants, they built an entire spiritual world of their own. Gods, tombs, and sacred symbols etched into the very rocks they lived in. And that's where we're headed next. Into the mysterious world of Nabatean religion, where power, death, and faith all fuse together in ways that still puzzle historians today. Imagine this. The sun is setting over Petra. The last light of day paints the cliffs blood red, and the noisy trading hub that roared with life all day suddenly falls quiet. But this silence isn't emptiness. It's a shift. Because when night cloaks the desert, Petra is no longer just a marketplace of incense and gold. It becomes a sacred stage, where the living and the dead share the same breath. The Nabateans were unusual in one striking way. They didn't leave us books. No epic poems like Homer's Iliad, no endless inscriptions like the Egyptians carved into every available wall. Instead, they left us stone. And in that stone, every carving, every facade, every tomb became a living manuscript of their worldview. Their chief god was Dushara, literally, Lord of the Mountain. Makes perfect sense. If your people live among sandstone cliffs and carve entire cities out of rock, of course your supreme deity is a god of stone. But here's the twist. Dushara wasn't a Zeus with flowing hair and a thunderbolt. He wasn't even human-shaped. His portrait was a block of stone, a cube, what archaeologists call beetles. To outsiders, it probably looked ridiculous. Wait, your almighty god is a brick? But that simplicity spoke volumes. Divinity didn't need a face. The god was already present in the very essence of the stone, in the same rock that gave birth to Petra itself. Beside him stood Al-Uzza, a goddess the Romans equated with Venus and the Greeks with Aphrodite. But unlike the Western versions, mostly about love and beauty, Al-Uzza was also a war goddess. To the Nabateans, womanhood embodied both tenderness and destruction. Think of her as an ancient Lady Gaga, dazzling and irresistible, but capable of swallowing an empire whole if she felt like it. Their temples weren't freestanding marble wonders like in Athens. They were carved straight into the cliffs. As you wander Petra, you see niches and altars cut into the rock, places where gods were believed to dwell. No towering columns, no marble domes, just stone. Simple, brutal, eternal. Their belief was clear. The divine wasn't far away in the sky. It lived right here in every rock you touched. But Petra wasn't only the city of gods, it was the city of the dead. By day, travelers gasp at the treasury's grand facade, like a Greek palace blasted into the cliffside. But keep walking, and you'll come across the royal tombs. Vast necropolises carved with such detail even Roman architects might have been jealous. Ironically, Petra may have had more tombs than homes. The entire city was like a monumental graveyard. Why? Because in Nabatean culture, your tomb was your business card for eternity. A wealthy merchant or noble didn't need to write books or erect statues. He just had to commission a tomb big enough, carved deep enough into the cliffs, so that every passing caravan would look up and think, "These people bury their dead more lavishly than we live." Death became the ultimate flex. Petra wasn't only a market, it was an eternal billboard. And religion here wasn't separate from politics. Nabatean kings, especially the famous Aretas IV, weren't just rulers. They were the CEOs of the Geas, gods. Their coins often showed the king's face crowned with sacred symbols. It was a marketing move as much as a spiritual one. Every transaction carried divine endorsement. Apple stamps a bitten fruit on your iPhone. Nabatean kings stamped their gods onto money to sell faith. Picture it. A Greek trader walks into Petra with a sack of incense. Before sealing a deal, he receives a Nabatean coin bearing the king's face, crowned with divine insignia. He thinks, well, if the gods themselves are backing this, maybe I won't get cheated. That's branding at its finest. Divinity as advertising, and here's the irony. The Greeks bragged with poetry, the Egyptians with pyramids, the Romans with law codes, the Nabateans, they bragged with tombs. They turned their city into a museum of death, where the living walked past monuments to the dead every single day. Which makes you wonder, were the Nabateans obsessed with death? Or were they simply using death as a megaphone to talk about life, that a human life may end but glory could be carved into stone forever? Maybe that's Petra's secret philosophy. Live humbly, but when you die, leave behind something that makes generations after you stop in their tracks. And looking at Petra today, 2,000 years later, you can't deny they pulled it off. The facades still tower over us. Their strategy worked, and perhaps the strangest part is this. A people with so few words, so little written record, managed to write their history in stone. And stone, unlike paper, doesn't burn, doesn't rot, doesn't forget. And in the next chapter, we'll leave the tombs and temples behind to step into Petra's other identity, its nightlife. Because Petra wasn't only a holy city, it was also a desert Las Vegas, where merchants came not just to trade, but to drink, gamble, and indulge after weeks of dust and danger on the caravan roads. Have you ever thought a city could be a temple, a cemetery, and a casino all at once? Sounds like satire, right? And yet, Petra, the crown jewel of the Nabateans, was exactly that. By day, you'd see hundreds of small niches carved into the cliffside, where the locals believed their gods dwelled. But when the sun dipped behind the desert hills, those very stone-cut chambers came alive with music, clinking cups, and the rattle of dice rolling across cold sandstone floors. It all began with their chief deity, Dushara, the lord of the mountain, and the way the Nabateans depicted him. Let's just say it wasn't Instagram-worthy. No majestic thunderbolt like Zeus, no radiant crown like Ra, just a cube, a plain stone block, what archaeologists call beetles. To outsiders, it looked laughable. Wait, that brick is your almighty god? But to the Nabateans, that block was everything. The divine didn't need a face, because it was already everywhere. In the cliffs, the mountains, the very stone they carved their city from. Standing beside Dushara was Al-Uzza. If he was permanence, she was fire. The Greeks equated her with Aphrodite, goddess of love. But here's the twist. Al-Uzza was also a war goddess, a deity who could give you a seductive glance one moment and take your life the next. In Petra, she wasn't housed in marble palaces. She was believed to inhabit small rock-cut shrines, sometimes no more than a niche for incense or flowers. Who needs a massive temple when the desert itself is your cathedral? And then there's Petra's other nickname, the City of the Dead. Why? Because there are more tombs here than houses. From the grand royal tombs, facades so ornate they could rival the Pantheon, to the humbler cliffside burials carved in haste, Petra feels less like a living city and more like a monumental graveyard. Walk through its streets and you're really walking through a necropolis. For the Nabateans, tombs were eternal calling cards. The bigger the tomb, the louder the message. This family was rich, powerful, unforgettable. Their kings knew how to play the brand game too. Take Aretas. Thai, for example. He ruled both economy and religion. Nabatean coins often showed his face paired with divine symbols. It was political marketing at its finest. When you pay taxes to the king, you're also making an offering to the gods. In Petra, divine logos were everywhere, etched into rock, stamped on money. Apple may have perfected the art of branding, but the Nabateans had been doing it 2,000 years earlier. But the real magic of Petra lay in its contradictions. By day, a solemn holy city, draped in symbols of eternity. By night, a desert Las Vegas. Merchants didn't trek hundreds of miles across blistering sand just to unload incense. They wanted to unwind, spend, and indulge. And the Nabateans, who lived outwardly modest lives, were brilliant at supplying temptation. Inside rock-cut chambers, oil lamps flickered, wine flowed like rivers. Don't think the desert meant dry throats. These people imported wine from Syria, Palestine, even Greece. Archaeologists have unearthed massive wine jars from Petra's tombs and houses. This wasn't an occasional indulgence. It was culture. Music filled the air. Greek lutes strumming, Arab drums pounding, a chorus of travelers raising cups in sync. Some nights ended in laughter, others in bodies passed out cold in the shadows of the cliffs. And of course, there was gambling. Excavations, uncovered bone dice and carved game boards. Picture it. A trader tossing down a pouch of frankincense as a bet. Dice rattling across the stone floor, while the chamber erupts in cheers and groans. One roll, you lose your year's profits. Another roll, you double them. And where there's wine and money, there's always flesh. The records don't spell it out, but let's be honest. If Petra was a trade hub buzzing with caravans, it almost certainly had its own red light district. Some historians even call it a stone-carved Vegas strip. Dramatic, sure, but not far from the truth. So Petra wasn't just a holy city. It wasn't just a necropolis, it was a playground, a place where gods and gamblers, priests and prostitutes, death and pleasure all coexisted within the same carved walls. And maybe that's why Petra still feels so magnetic, so unreal. Because in this one city, you could step out of a temple and into a tavern, walk past a tomb only to stumble into a dice game, move between ritual and revelry in the span of a few footsteps. Petra was, and remains, a paradox chiseled into stone. You know, no empire lasts forever. And Petra, the city carved out of stone, was no exception. What makes its story haunting isn't just how dazzling it once was, but how quietly it all faded away. No epic battle, no dramatic downfall, just silence, dust, and time. For centuries, the Nabateans ruled the incense route, the supply chain of the ancient world. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, ivory, all flowing from Arabia to the Mediterranean. They were basically Amazon Prime and Camel, caravans, but all it took was one market shift and the entire empire unraveled. The Romans, ever pragmatic, realized they didn't need to march goods through the desert anymore. They opened a sea route via the Red Sea, sending ships directly from southern Arabia into Egypt, then up the Nile to the Mediterranean. Faster, safer, cheaper. Suddenly, Petra, the desert hub, was bypassed. Like a layover airport abandoned once direct flights opened up. Caravans that once crowded Petra's narrow SEQ became fewer and fewer. Stone-cut taverns that once rang with laughter and music grew hollow. Merchants moved to the ports. Craftsmen followed the money. A city that had lived by trade began dying from it. And then came the heavier blows. In 106 CE, Rome formally annexed Nabatea, creating the province of Arabia Petraea. It sounded honorable, the name Petra still on the map, but the power was gone. Rabble II, the last Nabatean king, ruled in title only. When he died, the dynasty vanished. Petra, once a commercial superpower, was demoted to a provincial town in Rome's empire. The Romans did what they always did, Romanization. They built new structures, brought in their laws, stationed their legions, but what they couldn't conquer was nature. Earthquakes in the 4th century shattered Petra's lifeline, its sophisticated water channels and reservoirs. Remember, Petra survived the desert only because it mastered water. Without that, the city was like a body drained of blood. People left. Stone facades remained, but behind them, silence. By the 7th century, with the rise of Islam and trade routes shifting even further, Petra was a ghost. Temples that once glowed with oil lamps were swallowed in darkness. Tombs that once flaunted wealth now housed only swallows nesting in their cracks. Las Vegas in stone had become nothing more than a cemetery in the desert, and then it disappeared. For centuries, the West forgot Petra existed. It slipped off the maps, reduced to vague whispers in old texts. Local Bedouins knew of the Stone City, but they kept it secret like a treasure too dangerous to share. It wasn't until 1812 when Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt disguised himself as an Arab trader that Petra re-emerged. Imagine riding for days under a desert sun, then squeezing through a narrow canyon and suddenly, the treasury. A facade as tall as a 10-story building, carved straight into rose-red stone, glowing like fire. Burckhardt must have felt like he'd stumbled on a real-life Atlantis, only this one was hiding in plain sight. From that moment, Petra became a wonder once again. Archaeologists and adventurers flocked to it. UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site. Today, it's one of the new 7 wonders of the world. But the lesson Petra leaves behind is sobering. Even the greatest success can vanish, not with a war, but with a new route, a market shift, a shake of the earth. The Nabateans weren't defeated by swords. They were undone by trade diversions, earthquakes, and time itself. Stand before the treasury today, its towering facade cut into the cliffs, and remember, it was once a bank, once a temple, once a kind of desert casino. It carries within it the contradictions of human life, sacred and profane, prosperous and broken, eternal yet fragile. Petra isn't just stone, it's a reminder. A civilization can outsmart deserts, build wonders, and dominate trade, yet still be abandoned when the world decides to move on. Nothing is immortal. I like to think that by telling its story now, you and I are giving the Nabateans what they always wanted, not to vanish entirely into the sand. And if someday you find yourself walking through the Sikh, and the treasury suddenly appears before you in blazing sunlight, remember, those stones hold not just beauty, but also the echo of a people who once turned the desert into an empire. If this story gripped you, welcome to my world, where boring becomes fun and forgotten. History feels startlingly alive. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, not because YouTube wants it, but because you deserve more journeys like this. Journeys that make you curious, thoughtful, maybe even smile to yourself late at night. I'm Professor. This is Boring Becomes Fun, and next time we'll leave Petra behind and follow the Nile south, to Kush, where warrior queens called Candace once donned armor, took up swords, and forced mighty Rome itself to back down. What did the queens of Kush do all day? You've probably heard of Cleopatra, the most famous queen of Egypt, the woman who captivated Rome itself, from Julius Caesar to Mark Antony. But just a few hundred miles further south, there were other queens who didn't just sit on thrones but strapped on armor, took up swords, commanded armies on the battlefield, and at least once forced mighty Rome to back off. They were called the Candaces, the warrior queens of the kingdom of Kush. When we picture the Nile, most of us think of the pyramids at Giza, the Sphinx, or golden pharaohs ruling Egypt. But the Nile doesn't stop at Egypt's southern border. It keeps flowing into today's Sudan, into a land where a powerful, wealthy, and proud civilization thrived, only to be nearly erased from memory. That was Kush. And Kush wasn't some cheap knockoff of Egypt, far from it. At times, Kush was the dominant power. They even conquered Egypt, founding the 25th dynasty, when pharaohs weren't light-skinned rulers from the north, but black kings from Nubia. At other times, they were Egypt's allies, trading gold, ivory, and incense for Mediterranean luxuries. But here's what really sets Kush apart. While most ancient empires handed power to men, in Kush, women often ruled, and not as ceremonial figureheads. They ran the government, they signed treaties, they imposed taxes, and when war came, they rode to battle themselves. One of the most legendary Candaces, Aminarenas, went head-to-head with Augustus, the Roman emperor who took power after Caesar's death. She was blind in one eye, but that didn't stop her. Mounted on horseback, she led Kushite forces that beat the Romans back out of Nubia. The result? Rome had to sign a peace treaty. And remember, Rome almost never signed peace treaties with so-called barbarians. Imagine that. An African queen, someone your history textbook probably never even mentioned, brought the Roman Empire to its knees. And yet here's the irony. History remembers Cleopatra, but it almost completely forgot the Candaces. Kush got buried in Egypt's shadow. For centuries, Western historians glossed over it, as if an entire civilization could just blow away like sand in the desert wind. That's what I want to change today. In this episode, we're heading deep into ancient Nubia, where the sun scorches, the desert, where clusters of small pyramids stand like swarms of stone bees, where the clang of iron echoed from Meroe, the Pittsburgh of the ancient world, and where queens didn't hide behind palace curtains, but rode into the dust and chaos of war. So here's the question I want you to ask yourself. Why does history tell us the same handful of names again and again, while dozens of equally fascinating civilizations are left in silence? Maybe the forgotten stories are the ones most worth hearing, because they surprise us, challenge us, and in a way, feel more real. The Candaces of Kush prove it. They weren't Cleopatra's shadows. They were warriors, politicians, leaders, symbols of an independent and proud kingdom. So what did they actually do all day? How did they live, rule, and lead with such force that even pharaohs and Caesars had to respect them? That's the journey we're about to take. If you're ready, let's follow the Nile south beyond Egypt into Kush. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing in what is now Sudan. The sun feels like it's stuck directly above your head, burning everything it touches. Sand whips across your face in the desert wind. Around you, nothing but dry hills, red earth, scattered rocks. No trees, no shade, no sign of life. At first glance, you'd think, nobody could build a village here, let alone a civilization. And then, out of nowhere, you hear something soft. The faint sound of running water. You walk a few miles more and suddenly the whole scene changes. In front of you stretches the Nile, a ribbon of green and blue cutting straight through the barren land. Despite the blazing sun and the endless sand, along its banks are patches of fertile soil, clusters of trees, and villages clinging to life. This is more than a river. In the ancient world, the Nile was lifeblood, it was currency. It was Wi-Fi before Wi-Fi, connectivity for everyone who touched it. If you held the Nile, you had life, trade, and the chance to become an empire. The Greeks and Romans called this land Nubia. The name itself comes from the Egyptian word nub, which means gold. In other words, the brand identity of the place was baked right into its name. Welcome, we are the land of gold. And they weren't exaggerating. Pharaohs who wanted to coat their tombs in glittering gold or inlay statues of their gods, they had to buy from Kush, but Kush wasn't just about gold. They had iron, metal that could fuel economies and win wars. They had ivory, the luxury item Mediterranean elites couldn't get enough of. They had exotic woods, animal skins, and the caravan routes that linked Central Africa all the way up to the Mediterranean. Think of it like sitting at the crossroads of every interstate highway. Anyone passing through had to stop and, of course, had to pay a toll. And here's the key. Kush wasn't just Egypt's neighbor, some sidekick in the shadows. They weren't copying anyone. They built their own civilization with their own language, their own gods, and their own writing system. To this day, archaeologists are still struggling to fully crack the Meroitic script, the written language of Kush, because it's totally different from Egyptian hieroglyphs. If Egypt was Hollywood, famous, flashy, always in the spotlight, then Kush was Netflix. Quiet at first. But the moment you press play, you're hooked, and you wonder, why didn't I know about this before? And here's the plot twist. Pyramids. We've all been trained to associate pyramids with Egypt, but Kush built even more of them. At Meroe and Napata, you can still see hundreds of them. Sharper, steeper, clustered like black stone beehives scattered across the desert. Hills. In fact, Kush has more pyramids than Egypt. Smaller, yes, but sharper, more compact. And when Egypt stopped building pyramids, Kush kept going, almost as if they were saying, if you guys are bored of pyramids, fine. We'll take it from here. Their economy was so advanced it's hard not to compare it to modern times. Picture yourself in the market at Meroe, around 200 BCE. The air is filled with the metallic clang of iron being hammered into tools and weapons. Scholars have called Meroe the Pittsburgh of the ancient world because of the sheer scale of its iron industry. Around you are stacks of ivory, piles of gold, bundles of incense, hides, rare woods, everything packed onto camel caravans, stretching for miles, heading off across the desert to the Mediterranean coast. If today we have Amazon selling everything, FedEx shipping it, and Saudi Arabia making billions off natural resources, Kush was all three rolled into one. They had the goods, they controlled the shipping, and they had the gold to back it all up. And here's the genius move. Kush knew how to market itself. Those dense clusters of pyramids, that wasn't just architecture, it was branding. The temples, to their gods, branding. And the Candace queens, warrior women who ruled on the throne. The ultimate branding. Every foreign merchant who passed through saw it all and thought, okay, this isn't some backwater desert tribe. This is a world power. It's almost funny. Thousands of years before Apple, Kush had already nailed the concept of branding. They didn't need billboards or TV commercials. They had pyramids, they had gold, and they had queens riding into battle. That was all the advertising they needed. And this is just the beginning. From what looks at first like one of the harshest, most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, Kush rose, powered by the Nile, by gold, and by strategy, into a civilization strong enough to challenge Egypt itself. If you grew up in a Western classroom, chances are you heard Cleopatra's name over and over again. She's everywhere. Textbooks, movies, even pop songs. But here's the paradox. You could sit through 12 years of school and never once hear the name Candace. And that's the injustice. Because in Kush, just south of Egypt, women weren't just ornaments of the royal court. They ruled. They signed treaties. They levied taxes. And when the time came, they strapped on armor, mounted horses, and led armies into battle. These queens carried the title Candace. Now don't confuse it with a personal name. Candace was a royal title, like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome. So when history mentions Candace Amanirenas, it's not a first name, it's her title as the supreme queen of Kush. For more than a century, one Candace after another sat on the throne, shaping the destiny of their kingdom. Among them, Amanirenas stands out. She's remembered as the queen who faced down Rome itself, the superpower of her time. Picture the scene. It's 24 BCE. Augustus, fresh off his victory in Egypt, is building the foundations of an empire that stretches from Spain to Syria. He looks south to Nubia and thinks, this will be easy. To him, Kush was just some poor neighbor of Egypt. He was wrong. Waiting for him was no ragtag militia, but Candace Amanirenas herself, astride a horse, spear in hand, blind in one eye, but fiercer than any Roman general. To the Romans, women on the battlefield were laughable, and yet here she was, making them pay dearly for underestimating her. The war was brutal. Kushite forces raided Roman garrisons in northern Nubia, even pushing deep into Roman Egypt. Ancient inscriptions tell us they carried off a bronze statue of Augustus himself, ripped straight from a Roman temple. The statue's head was later buried beneath the steps of a temple in Meroe, so that every worshipper would literally walk on Augustus's face, a humiliation Rome could never forgive. Of course, the Romans struck back, disciplined, relentless, but Amanirenas refused to break. She fought them with ambushes, cutting supply lines, harassing their troops. In the end, something extraordinary happened. Augustus, who bent entire nations to his will, was forced to negotiate. Rome withdrew. Kush stayed independent, no tribute, no chains, just a peace treaty signed on equal terms. That almost never happened. Rome didn't sign treaties. With barbarians, Rome crushed them, but not Kush, not Amanirenas. Let me put it with a bit of irony. While many European kings were busy being terrified of their wives at home, Augustus, the so-called son of a god, was compelled to bow to a one-eyed African queen. History does have a wicked sense of humor, and Amanirenas wasn't the only one. Other Candaces, Amanishaketo, Amanitore, built temples, managed the kingdom's wealth, ruled Meroe with authority. They weren't Cleopatra's shadow. They were queens in their own right, warriors and rulers who stamped their power on architecture, politics, and the battlefield. What fascinates me most is how normal female power was in Kush. While Rome debated whether women should be allowed to speak in public, while Athens locked them inside their homes unless escorted by men, in Kush, people were used to seeing a queen in armor on horseback commanding soldiers. And if you're wondering whether this is just legend, the evidence is clear. Inscriptions from Meroe, Roman accounts, archaeological finds, they all point to the same truth. Candace Amanirenas was real, and she really did make Augustus retreat. So when we talk about civilizations that history tried to erase, Kush is a perfect example. They prove that power didn't always belong to the usual suspects. Rome, Greece, Egypt. Sometimes it belonged to a land of burning deserts watered by the Nile, led by a queen with one eye who stared down the might of an empire. And that's only one piece of the story. Because the Candace tradition isn't just about war, it's about how a civilization redefined what women could be. And that's a lesson that still resonates today. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. You're standing on a ridge of desert sand, looking down into a valley where the city of Meroe once pulsed with life. At night, the glow of furnaces lit the sky like 100 stars, and the clanging of hammers echoed through the dark. This wasn't just a capital, it was an African Pittsburgh before Pittsburgh existed, a city where iron and gold flowed like twin rivers fueling power. When people talk about Egypt, they picture pyramids, pharaohs, and statues wrapped in gold. But when you talk about Kush, specifically Meroe, you have to imagine something different. The constant ring of metal on metal, the smoke of charcoal staining the air, caravans crowding dusty streets under a haze of gold dust and iron sparks. Even the Romans, who weren't easily impressed, called it the city of iron. And they weren't exaggerating. Hundreds of furnaces burned day and night. Men worked shirtless, blackened with soot, their muscles gleaming in the firelight as they pulled molten metal from clay furnaces, hammering it into tools and weapons. The swords forged here weren't ceremonial. They were carried by Kushite soldiers, the very same warriors who clashed with Rome under Queen Amanirenas. Imagine a legionnaire bracing himself, only to feel his shield split by a Kushite blade sharper and stronger than anything he expected. Now zoom in on an ordinary morning in Meroe. At sunrise, young boys and enslaved workers carried water from the Nile, balancing jars on their backs. In the industrial quarter, bellows hissed, flames roared, and the sound of hammering set the rhythm of the city. The smell of charcoal and hot iron hung heavy in the air, mixed with desert wind. It was the scent of industry, the smell of wealth and power, though probably not something you'd want bottled as perfume. And yet Meroe wasn't only iron. It was gold, real, dazzling gold. Nubian mines supplied the precious metal that decorated temples, crowns, and coffins all across the Mediterranean. Pharaohs in Egypt, senators in Rome, and merchants in Greece all lusted after Kushite gold. And there was ivory from Central Africa, hardwoods from lush forests, animal skins, and exotic goods from faraway lands. Meroe sat at the crossroads of trade, like a toll booth at the center of ancient highways. Everything passed through and everything was taxed. That's how empires grow rich. The city itself was a marketplace of contrasts. Picture the riverfront, boats unloading amphorae of wine, glass, and olive oil from the Mediterranean, while caravans lumbered in from the south, their backs heavy with ivory and frankincense. Somewhere nearby, a Greek merchant haggles over jars of wine, while the ring of hammers never stops in the background. Meroe was both factory and marketplace, both industrial powerhouse and cultural hub, but Meroe wasn't all grit and smoke. Beyond the furnaces stood rows of sharp, elegant pyramids rising from sandy hills. Hundreds of them, smaller than Egypt's Giza but far more numerous. From afar, they looked like black stone beehives scattered across golden dunes. Egypt had long since given up building pyramids, but the Kushites kept going as if to declare, "We are heirs to this tradition now. And we'll make it our own." That's what made Meroe unique. It wasn't a shadow of Cairo or Thebes. It had its own script, Meroitic, which scholars still struggle to decode. Its rulers worshipped their own gods, minted their own coins, and carved their queens into history alongside their kings. In temple reliefs, you see Candaces in armor, riding horses, brandishing spears. These weren't myths. They were public statements carved in stone. Meroe was a place where women could rule, where iron met faith, where pyramids rose not as tombs of pharaohs, but as symbols of a proud new identity. Some historians compare it to Florence during the Renaissance, where art, politics, and commerce collided. Personally, I think it feels more like 19th century New York, a city of smoke, ambition, and endless trade, a place that pulled in everything and everyone around it. So picture this final scene. A Greek trader, dusty from travel, steps into the bustling market of Meroe. He delivers his amphorae of red wine and in return receives polished ivory and glittering gold. In the distance, sparks fly from the forges as swords are hammered sharp. Behind him, pyramids dot the horizon like stone teeth. He lifts a cup of wine, breathes in the thick air of smoke and heat, and knows in his gut, this isn't just a city. This is the beating heart of a civilization. And yet today, if you visit Meroe, what you'll see are ruins, piles of blackened slag from ancient furnaces, broken walls, and lonely pyramids standing in silence. But if you close your eyes, you can still almost hear it. The rhythm of hammers, the hiss of fire, the murmur of trade, the heartbeat of a city that once made the world stop and pay attention. And it's from this backdrop, this mix of iron, gold, and ambition, that daily life in Kush really comes into focus. How they ate, how they dressed, what they believed in, and how they found joy. That's where we're heading next. Close your eyes and imagine stepping into the bustling marketplace of Meroe, the beating heart of the Kushite kingdom. Forget for a moment the picture you might have in mind when someone says African desert, the endless sand, the lifeless heat. Here the air is alive. You hear the constant clang of hammers striking anvils, the whoosh of bellows feeding roaring furnaces, and you smell the thick smoke of charcoal mixed with molten iron. Traders from distant lands push through the crowd, bringing salt, fine linen, and amphorae of Mediterranean wine to barter for Kushite gold, iron, and ivory. What's striking about daily life in Kush is that it wasn't just a footnote to Egypt, it was its own world, with its own rhythms and traditions. At sunrise, farmers tended fields along the Nile, planting wheat, barley, and millet, grains that fed the entire region. But Kush wasn't only about farming. Herds of cattle roamed the countryside, and hunters went deep into the savannas in search of elephants, whose tusks were prized like diamonds by the elite of Greece and Rome. To a Kushite teenager hauling back a massive ivory tusk, it was a trophy. To a Mediterranean aristocrat, it was pure luxury. Their style was equally distinct. Like the Egyptians, Kushites wore linen, but their tastes leaned toward brighter colors. Reds, blues, and yellows splashed into their clothing. Women adorned themselves with heavy gold jewelry, often studded with gems, while men wore cloaks and long robes on ceremonial days. Look at the statues of Kushite queens. Broad-shouldered, commanding, nothing like the delicate, willowy ideals of Greek art. In Kush, strength and fullness were symbols of power and prestige. Religion wrapped daily life in ritual and symbolism. They worshipped gods you'd recognize like Amun, but gave them a distinctly Nubian twist. At Jebel Barkal, Amun was the supreme god, and at Naka they revered Apetamak, a lion-headed war god who embodied ferocity and dominance. Imagine a festival in his honor, drums pounding, incense thick in the air, warriors marching before a colossal lion statue. You can almost feel the ground shake beneath your feet. But religion was just one side of life. Music, games, and drink filled the evenings. The Kushites played drums, flutes, and small harps. They danced, sang, and laughed around firelight. Archaeologists have even found dice carved from bone, evidence that games of chance entertained families after long days of work. Picture a household sitting by the fire, parents sipping millet beer, children rattling dice on the floor, while outside a caravan of camels ambled into the city gates. And yes, beer and wine were staples. They brewed their own beer from barley and millet. But fine wine was imported from Egypt and the Mediterranean. At an elite banquet, you might see both. Hearty mugs of local brew alongside delicate cups of imported red wine. It was cosmopolitan, but rooted in the land. What makes Kush stand apart is the role of women woven into all this. They weren't confined to the shadows. Women ran stalls in the market, led rituals at temples, and in some cases, commanded armies as Candaces. The same cultural fabric that allowed a queen like Amanirenas to face down Rome also let everyday women wield real influence in family and community life. So while Egypt often felt like one grand stage play orbiting around Pharaoh, Kush was more like a chorus of many voices: farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, musicians, women, warriors, rulers, all shaping a society at once fierce, vibrant, and unmistakably alive. And from this tapestry of daily life, we arrive at the most fascinating thread. When the queens of Kush stepped out of palaces, donned armor, and etched their names into history through blood, defiance, and victory. Imagine a sunrise in Nubia. The first rays of light spill across the desert, catching the sharp tips of small pyramids at Meroe, turning the sand into gold. Drums echo from the hills, deep and heavy, and on the horizon, a column of soldiers appears. But the most striking figure isn't a warrior with a bow or a chariot gleaming in the dawn. It's a woman, armor flashing, one eye covered, seated high on a horse. That's Candace Amanirenas, the queen who forced the mighty Roman Empire to sign a peace treaty. History usually tells us war was a man's game, pharaohs, Caesars, kings. But in Kush, things were different. Candace wasn't a personal name. It was a royal title like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome. And here's the twist. In Kush, the one who bore that title wasn't always a king. Many times it was a queen. And not a ceremonial figurehead, but the one truly in charge. Roman writers, who honestly hated to admit defeat, still recorded what happened. A Candace led Kushite armies into battle and forced Rome to retreat. Imagine that scene. A one-eyed queen raising her sword, rallying troops and charging at disciplined Roman legions. For a culture that mocked the very idea of women on the battlefield, this must have been unthinkable. Yet it happened. The most famous clash came in the 1st century BC. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, the man who expanded the empire from Spain to Syria, decided to push south into Nubia. He thought it would be easy. After all, to Roman eyes, Kush was just Egypt's poor neighbor, but waiting for him was Candace Amanirenas. She knew the desert. She knew the terrain, and she had an army armed with iron weapons forged in the furnaces of Meroe. The Kushites struck fast, raiding Roman forts, even pushing into Egypt itself. In one of the most audacious acts of defiance, they ripped down a bronze statue of Augustus and carried it back to Meroe. There, they buried it under the steps of a temple. So, every worshipper walking in would literally tread on the emperor of Rome. That's not just victory. That's trolling on a monumental scale. Of course Rome struck back. Their machine of war was too strong to ignore. But Kush didn't break. Amanirenas fought with guerrilla tactics, harassing supply lines, refusing to fight on Rome's terms. In the end, something extraordinary happened. Augustus agreed to peace. Rome withdrew, Kush remained independent, and, get this, they didn't have to pay tribute. Think about how rare that is. Rome almost never backed down. Yet here, in the blazing deserts of Africa, they had no choice. And yes, let's be honest, it's deliciously ironic. While Roman men debated whether women should even speak in public, their emperor was cutting a deal with a one-eyed African queen. Amanirenas wasn't the only Candace. There was Amani-Shaketo, who built temples and left behind treasures that would later astonish archaeologists. There was Amanitore, who expanded Meroe and presided over a flourishing kingdom. Each of these queens ruled not from behind a veil, but out in the open, leading armies, signing treaties, taxing trade caravans, commanding respect. And Kushite art makes that clear. In temple carvings, queens are often depicted larger than men, towering over kings or generals. That wasn't sloppy art, it was intentional symbolism. It shouted, "Here, women are power." Compare that to Greek or Roman statues, where women are always soft, delicate, secondary. In Kush, queens were carved as giants. Picture a day in the life of a Candace. Morning council with generals, planning raids or defenses. Midday meeting with merchants, setting tariffs on gold and ivory. Afternoon ceremony at the lion-headed temple of Epidemic, receiving blessings from priests. And if trouble came, she'd mount a horse, spear in hand, riding into the dust and chaos of battle. How many civilizations could show you that image? A queen as warrior, ruler, and priestess all at once? And yet here's the tragedy. You probably never heard her name in school. Cleopatra, yes, over and over. But Candace Amanirenas? Silence. Why? Because history was written by Rome, and Rome had no interest in remembering a queen who embarrassed them. Easier to bury her in the footnotes than admit the empire once bent to Nubia. But every time we speak her name, every time we tell her story, we chip away at that silence. Because Candace isn't just a historical curiosity, she's proof. Proof that power can wear armor and ride into war, even if it comes in the form of a woman with one eye. Proof that a desert kingdom could stand toe-to-toe with Rome and not flinch. Proof that history is bigger, richer, and more complicated than the version we were handed. So next time you think of ancient queens, don't just stop at Cleopatra. Remember the Candaces of Kush. Remember the pyramids of Meroe rising sharp against the sand. Remember the sound of hooves, the flash of iron, and a queen who made Rome sign her peace terms. You see, the Candaces in the kingdom of Kush were never just shadows of Egypt. They had their own identity, their own power. They once stood tall enough to force mighty Rome, the empire that called itself invincible, into signing a treaty during the age of Augustus. And yet time and history can be cruel. Trade routes shifted, wars dragged on, and the silence of Western historians buried Kush in the shadows. Cleopatra's name appears on every page of every school book, while the Candaces, the warrior queens who rode elephants into battle, who bore scars over one eye but still sat tall in the saddle, were nearly erased from our collective memory. That's exactly why I think we need to tell their story. Because sometimes the voices forgotten by history give us the truest lessons. That power can wear a woman's face, that a kingdom in the harshest corner of Africa could hold its head high, and that history isn't always written by the strongest, but by whoever happens to hold the pen. So if this story sparked something in you, If it gave you a fresh perspective on the ancient world, don't let it fade away like the civilizations history chose to forget. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, not because YouTube says so, but because you deserve more stories like this. Stories that turn boring into fun, and history into something alive, surprising, and strangely close to home. And remember, our journey doesn't end here. Because up north, as Kush began to fade, another city rose to haunt Rome like a nightmare. They called it Carthage, the New York of the Mediterranean, home of Hannibal, the general who led elephants across the Alps and made even Rome tremble. That's where we're headed next. Video 3. Why Rome Feared Carthage. This isn't just a war for land, it's a story about obsession, so deep that the Romans repeated it like a curse. Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. I'm Professor. This is Boring Becomes Fun. And I'll see you in Carthage, where the elephants didn't just march across deserts, they shook the heart of Europe. What did the people of Carthage actually do all day? Imagine this for a moment. When we talk about the ancient world, the names that usually pop into our heads are Rome and Greece. The grand monuments, the famous philosophers, the legendary generals, all of it carved deep into Western cultural memory. But what about Carthage? This was once a city so wealthy that people called it the New York of the Mediterranean, a city that dominated the seas, kept Rome awake at night, and produced one of the most brilliant military minds in history, Hannibal, the man who marched elephants across the Alps straight into Italy's heartland. And yet, Carthage is gone, erased so completely that legends say the Romans poured salt into its soil, so nothing would ever grow there again. You might wonder, how could a civilization this powerful disappear, leaving behind only ruins scattered across modern-day Tunisia? And why has history nearly scrubbed them from our collective memory, when their story deserves to stand right alongside Rome and Athens? Carthage began as a Phoenician colony, founded by master sailors from what is now Lebanon. From a small harbor, it grew into the richest trade hub of the Mediterranean. Goods from Spain, Africa, even Greece passed through its docks. The Carthaginians built a navy second to none, commanded vast trading networks, and became the merchants of the ancient world. To Rome, Carthage wasn't just a rival, it was a nightmare they couldn't ignore. But I don't just want to tell you about battles, because Carthage wasn't just Rome's enemy. It was a living, breathing city with its own lifestyle, its own beliefs and daily rhythms that feel strangely familiar, and sometimes disturbingly alien. What did Carthaginians eat? Who did they worship? How did they spend their nights? And what did they really think of the empires around them? In this episode, we're going back to Carthage, a maritime powerhouse that once blazed like a lighthouse across the Mediterranean only to vanish like smoke in the wind. We'll set sail with their merchants, peek inside their darkest religious rites, and finally, watch their world collapse in fire, so devastating that Rome repeated it like a curse. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. So if you're ready, come with me. Let's dive into the mystery of Carthage and ask the question, what did the people of Carthage actually do all day? Picture this. You're a Greek merchant from Corinth or Rhodes. After days at sea rowing across the endless blue of the Mediterranean, you finally spot land. And there it is, Carthage. From a distance, the first thing you see isn't farmland or little houses, but walls. Towering, massive walls. Stone ramparts so high and thick that later Roman historians would write, even the largest army hesitated before them. And beyond those walls, rising like a forest of masts, is the pride of Carthage, their navy. Ships packed so tightly together it looks like a grove of trees swaying on the waves. As your ship pulls into harbor, you realize something unusual. Carthage doesn't just have one port, it has two. One, rectangular in shape, is a bustling commercial dock. Here you'd find goods from every corner of the ancient world: silver from Spain, wheat from North Africa, ivory from Central Africa, wine from Greece, incense from the East. The second port, circular and heavily fortified, is reserved for the Carthaginian war fleet. People said a single signal from the tower in the center could launch hundreds of ships at once, a nightmare scenario for any enemy at sea. To foreign eyes, Carthage must have looked like the Dubai of the ancient world, glittering, crowded, and rich. Its secret was geography. Carthage sat right in the middle of the Mediterranean, like a toll booth controlling every trade route. Ships sailing from Spain to Greece or from Italy down to Africa all passed this way. And Carthage, of course, never forgot to collect its cut. But Carthage wasn't an accident of fortune. Its people were descendants of the Phoenicians, master sailors from Tyre, in today's Lebanon. They brought with them shipbuilding expertise, navigational brilliance, and a merchant's instinct for profit. If the Phoenicians were the Amazon of the ancient world, Carthage was their global headquarters, the place where every skill, every ambition, every hunger for control over trade came together. Walk the stone streets of Carthage, and you'd see whitewashed houses glowing in the Mediterranean sun, shops spilling with pottery, textiles, spices, and jewelry, the shouts of traders mixing with children's laughter, the pounding of hammers from shipyards, and the chant of priests echoing from temples to Baal Hammon and the goddess Tanit, the city's divine protectors. Carthage didn't just feel like a city. It felt alive. Every person, every ship, every coin and sack of grain pulsing like blood through its veins. The Greeks and Romans couldn't help but look on with a mix of envy and suspicion. To them, Carthage was the New York City of its age, a place that never slept, never stopped trading, and always stayed one step ahead. Carthage didn't chase glory and philosophy like Athens, or pure military tradition like Sparta, or legal power like Rome. Instead, they quietly stockpiled silver and gold, built fleets, and controlled trade routes. A cold, practical strategy, but one so effective it made them Rome's greatest rival. Stand on the deck of your ship at sunset, and Carthage gleams like a jewel on the coast. But behind that brilliance lurk shadows, strange rituals that shocked the world, and wars that would ultimately decide its fate. And this is just the first glimpse of Carthage, a proud, dangerous, ocean-facing city-state. In the next part, we'll go deeper. What did Carthaginians eat, wear, and believe? And what made their society so different from the Greeks and Romans around them? Imagine waking up in Carthage on an ordinary morning. The city doesn't rise with roosters, it rises with commerce. The cries of seagulls circle above the harbor, the pounding of hammers echoes from the shipyards, and street vendors call out their prices from crowded stalls. Carthage wakes with the sun because here every hour is money. The wealthy, merchants, and aristocrats head toward the central square, a kind of ancient stock exchange. There they haggle over the price of silver from Iberian mines, count the new shipment of ivory just hauled in from Central Africa, or debate how much wheat is expected from the fertile delta lands. And of course, there are the slave markets. Men, women, and children captured from distant places, folded into the machinery of Carthage's prosperity. What sounds like numbers on a ledger is, in truth, the fate of thousands, and the foundation of the city's wealth. Meanwhile, everyday people are busy in their own ways. Workshops clatter with pottery wheels, metalwork, and looms. Out in the fields, North African farmers plow the rich soil, raising wheat and barley that not only fed Carthage but also filled ships bound for every corner of the Mediterranean. Sailors, for their part, start the day training or prepping for long voyages, because Carthage's navy wasn't just pride, it was survival. And then there's something Rome never quite understood. Women in Carthage had unusual freedom. Unlike Roman women, who were mostly bound to the household, Carthaginian women could own property, run businesses, and play visible roles in religious life. Some scholars suggest this flexibility gave Carthage resilience, because half its population wasn't shut away but actively fueling its economy and culture. Even their food tells the story of a city built on trade. At the tables of the rich, there'd be seafood fresh from the port, grilled fish, stews flavored with imported herbs, and wine from Greece or Italy alongside local vintages. For ordinary citizens, the staple was simpler: barley bread, filling, and sturdy enough to power a day of labor. Picture a 15-year-old boy in Carthage. At dawn, he trains with his peers, rowing under the watch of naval officers, because every citizen was expected to be ready for the sea. At noon, he eats a quick meal of bread and fish while his mother haggles over the price of cloth at the marketplace. And by sunset, he follows his father to the docks, watching great ships from Iberia unload silver that glitters in the fading light. To him, this wasn't just trade. It was proof that Carthage was strong, that its ships ruled the waves, and that his own future was tied to those sails. In Carthage, a single day wasn't just work. It was a portrait of a society layered by wealth, powered by trade, and confident that its double harbors and mighty fleets would keep it safe forever. But, as history reminds us, those golden days were only the beginning of a story as brilliant as it was tragic. In the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into Carthage's economy, politics, and naval power, the engines that transformed it from a port city into Rome's most feared rival. Imagine stepping into ancient Carthage, not through its harbor, not through its massive gates, but through the smoke-filled courtyards of its temples. The air is heavy with incense. Chants rise in unison, hands stretch toward the sky, and statues glow in the flicker of sacred flames. Like every civilization, the people of Carthage didn't live on bread and wine alone. They lived on belief. And for them, that belief rested on two divine pillars: Baal Hammon and the goddess Tanit. Baal Hammon was fire, the sun, the harvest. If Rome had Jupiter and Greece had Zeus, Carthage had Baal, an austere, gray-bearded god seated on a throne, staff in hand, gaze stern as if to say, "Whether your barley grows or withers, that's up to me." At his side was Tanit, goddess of the moon, fertility, and family. Her image was strikingly simple, a triangle topped with a circle. Minimalist enough to look like a modern logo, but carved everywhere, from stone stelae to pendants and rings. Religion in Carthage wasn't a distant state-only affair. It seeped into daily life. Before a merchant set sail, he offered prayers to Tanit. Before a farmer sowed his field, he sacrificed to Baal, hoping for rain. Every treaty, every trade agreement was sealed under divine watch, as if Baal and Tanit were silent shareholders in Carthage's entire economy. But here's where the story darkens, and where Carthage's name forever tangled with controversy: the claim of child sacrifice. If you open a Roman history book, you'll find lurid descriptions. Parents placing infants onto the bronze hands of a god's statue, flames consuming the offering, drums beating to drown out the cries. Roman writers painted it as barbarism, so grotesque that Carthage, they said, deserved to be wiped off the map. But can we trust that? Rome hated Carthage. Hated them enough that if Carthage sneezed, Rome would accuse them of plotting plague. So the question lingers: was this truth, or was it propaganda, an ancient smear campaign? Archaeology has uncovered the so-called Tophet of Carthage, a cemetery filled with urns containing the ashes of infants and animals, often marked with symbols of Baal or Tanit. The evidence is undeniable, but what it means is fiercely debated. Was this truly a site of ritual sacrifice, or simply a burial ground for children who died young in an era of high infant mortality? Some scholars argue the former, that the inscriptions and context point to sacrifice. Others push back, saying Rome exaggerated the practice into horror stories to justify Carthage's destruction. And there's a third possibility, that sacrifices, if they happened, were rare, reserved for moments of absolute desperation: famine, drought, or war. A last resort, not an everyday ritual. Yet once Rome got hold of the tale, a single desperate act was enough to brand an entire people as monsters. What's undeniable is that religion sat at the core of Carthage. It shaped law, trade, diplomacy, and, thanks to Roman propaganda, shaped how posterity judged them. And Tophet, with its urns and ashes, still stands as a haunting question mark. Did Carthage really sacrifice its children for survival? Or did their enemies sacrifice their reputation to history? Either way, Carthage leaves us with a chilling lesson. Faith can be both a pillar of identity and a weapon, wielded within to unify, or by enemies to vilify. In Carthage's case, it became both the heartbeat of their society and the dagger Rome drove into their legacy. Next, we'll move to the final act, the fall of Carthage. When negotiation gave way to obsession, when hatred became destiny, and when the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, echoed through the Roman Senate as a death sentence. Picture yourself in Carthage on a bright morning in 216 BCE. The drums are pounding in the city square, merchants drop their tablets of accounts, and crowds surge into the streets. The news has arrived. Hannibal, scion of the powerful Barca family, has crushed the Romans at Cannae. Word spreads like wildfire, rivers of Roman blood, more than 50,000 soldiers cut down in a single day. Carthage erupts in celebration. From the harbor to the narrowest alleys, wine is poured, songs are sung, and hope ignites. Rome will finally kneel. Hannibal Barca. His very name sent shivers through Rome. He wasn't a bureaucrat, but a battlefield genius, raised in a household that breathed hatred for Rome. As a boy, his father brought him to the altar, laid Hannibal's small hand upon it, and made him swear, "I will never be a friend to Rome." That oath guided his life. His plan was audacious, so bold that even fellow Carthaginians doubted him. Instead of waiting for Rome to attack, Hannibal would bring the war straight to their doorstep. He gathered an army, Numidian cavalry, Iberian, mercenaries, and most shockingly, war elephants. Imagine it. Not tanks, not bombers, elephants, towering, thundering beasts that terrified anyone who had never seen them before. And he led this force across the Alps, through blizzards, sheer cliffs, avalanches. Soldiers froze to death, elephants slipped into ravines. Yet somehow, against all odds, Hannibal descended into northern Italy. He was Rome's nightmare made flesh. Rome reeled. No one believed Carthage's army could cross mountains to invade from the north. For years, Hannibal marched across Italy, winning again and again, at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae. At Cannae, he perfected the double envelopment maneuver, swallowing 70,000 Romans in a tightening vice. It was a masterpiece of annihilation, still taught in military academies today. Back in Carthage, life was a strange mix of pride and dread. Citizens traded goods in the marketplace by morning, celebrated Hannibal's victories by noon, and whispered anxiously about Rome's inevitable retaliation by night. Carthage was a strange hybrid, a commercial Sparta, a nation of merchants who always had to be soldiers too. There were days of jubilation. Statues of Hannibal were paraded, families toasted him with wine, mothers told their children, "We have a hero who makes Rome tremble." But there were also days of despair. When no surrender came from Rome, when defeats trickled back, fear crept in. Rome had manpower, money, and iron resolve. Carthage had Hannibal, but not enough reinforcements. At home, the elites hesitated, divided, unwilling to fully back his campaigns. Rome, meanwhile, refused to break. They rebuilt their armies after every disaster and slowly turned the tide. Imagine being a Carthaginian teenager then. In the morning, you row at the harbor as part of military training. At midday, you eat grilled fish with coarse barley bread. At night, you sit with your father by the sea, watching ships from Iberia unload silver bullion, listening to adults argue, will Hannibal's brilliance be enough, or will Rome one day march south and burn Carthage to the ground? Your childhood smells of saltwater, smoke, and the bitter tang of war. Hannibal's brilliance carved his name into eternity, but it also sealed Carthage's fate. He became the ghost Rome could never exorcise. His victories gave Carthage glory, but also branded it forever as Rome's mortal enemy. And that shadow, both triumphant and tragic, hung over the city until the Senate in Rome finally declared, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. And that takes us to the final chapter, the fiery end of Carthage. When obsession trumped diplomacy, when hatred hardened into destiny, and when one of the wealthiest cities of the ancient world vanished in blood and flame. Imagine standing on a sandy ridge looking out over the Mediterranean in 149 BCE. Below you, the Roman fleet spreads across the water like a silver scar. Not a handful of ships, hundreds, each bristling with soldiers, siege engines, and one shared purpose: Carthage must cease to exist. The siege lasted 3 long years. In that time, Carthage, once a bustling trading hub, became a fortress of desperation. Blacksmiths who had once forged farm tools and spearheads for export now hammered weapons for their neighbors. Women cut their hair to weave into bowstrings. Children dashed through alleys hauling water and stones. Every home became part of the battlements. They weren't just defending walls, they were fighting for the right to exist. But Rome, once haunted by the name Hannibal, was determined not to repeat old mistakes. The Senate had decided, if Carthage still breathed, it was still a threat. The noose tightened daily. Hunger hollowed out the city. Shoes and leather were boiled for food. Ancient accounts even whisper that the dead themselves were used to stave off starvation a little longer. When hope flickered out, Rome struck the final blow. In 146 BCE, Carthage fell. For 6 days straight, Roman legions advanced street by street, wall by wall. Smoke blotted out the sky. The smell of burning wood mixed with the stench of burning flesh. Rivers of blood stained the stone streets. When it was over, some 50,000 survivors were chained and marched away into slavery. The New York of the Mediterranean was reduced to rubble and ash, and then came the story of the salt. Later writers claimed the Romans plowed salt into the earth so nothing would ever grow again. Modern historians doubt it actually happened. Most likely it was symbolic. But the symbolism itself tells the truth. Rome didn't just want to destroy Carthage's walls. It wanted to erase Carthage's memory, its future, its very possibility of life. That, in many ways, was the cruelest victory. Rome understood that battles win wars, but stories win history. Almost everything we know about Carthage today comes from Roman pens, and Rome hated Carthage. So Carthage survived in memory only as the villain, the barbarian, the other, not as the thriving commercial capital, the cultural crossroads, or the complex, ambitious society it really was. That's the deepest tragedy. Carthage didn't just lose its city, it lost its voice. When we ask who writes history, the answer is always the same: the victor. And in this case, it was Rome. Carthage became a character in Rome's epic, not the author of its own. Yet if you listen closely, Carthage still whispers through the ruins, in the remains of its great twin harbors that once held thousands of ships, in the broken pottery shards that tell us what they ate, in the coins stamped with the faces of gods they prayed to. Those fragments remind us, this was once a city that traded, dreamed, loved, and hoped. Rome may have destroyed the walls, but it couldn't erase every trace. And maybe that's the real lesson. Carthage's importance isn't just in how it fell, but in the fact that it once made Rome, the so-called unshakable empire, so afraid, it resorted to annihilation. A civilization never truly dies as long as people still speak its name. Carthage was buried, but it was never completely gone. Carthage in our memory isn't just about casualty numbers, trade routes, or battle maps. It was once a living, breathing city. Merchants in white robes haggling over ivory on the docks. Families offering incense to Baal Hammon and Tanit. Children laughing in the shadow of massive walls that today survive only as broken stone. A city that lived by the sea and gasped under the shadow of endless war. Now picture this final scene. You're standing on the coast of modern-day Tunisia. The waves still roll in. The salty wind still cuts across your face. But before you is silence, just ruins where Carthage once stood, a metropolis once called the New York of the ancient world. The city is gone, yet its echo lingers, carried in each wave that breaks on the shore, reminding us that no empire is truly immortal. With Carthage, we close out the first arc of this journey. 3 stories, 3 civilizations, 3 very different fates. From the Nabateans of Petra to the proud queens of Kush, to the city by the sea that Rome burned to ash. All share one truth. History forgets the defeated. And only when we pause to listen do we hear the voices still whispering through the dust. But this isn't the end. Far from it. Beyond the Mediterranean, there are forests concealing kingdoms in Africa, wooden cities swallowed by the snows of northern Europe, and strange empires that rose and vanished in Asia without a trace in our textbooks. We've only scratched the surface, so if you want to keep traveling, hit subscribe and tap the bell. Not because YouTube needs another click, but because you deserve more stories like this. Stories that turn history from dry and distant into something alive, curious and full of surprises. In the next arc, we'll leave these sunlit shores and venture farther, into civilizations you've probably never even heard of. Are you ready to step into the unknown? I'm Professor. This is Boring Becomes Fun. And I'll see you on the next road, where history will keep revealing the strangest, boldest, and most human things people have ever done.